I remember those dimly lit streets of my London, where the air itself seemed heavy with coal smoke, and where layers of industrial grime settled on every surface with such determination that one could almost taste the soot with every breath. Cleanliness, you see, was not merely a question of soap and water, no. In those days, it was a moral struggle, a battle against the filth that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice of our lives, dividing us as starkly as the grand stone mansions of the West End were divided from the overcrowded slums of the East. I could not help but notice how the upper classes, with their perfumed silks and polished boots, seemed to glide through a cleaner, brighter version of the city, while we working folk trudged through mud and muck, our very skin marked by the struggle. For those of us in the tenements cramped and noisy with life, entire families crammed into single rooms, bathing was not a daily ritual, nor even a weekly one for many. If fortune smiled upon us, there might be a cold tap down the hall, shared by dozens of neighbors. But more often than not, a single battered basin or a pail fetched from a distant pump sufficed. And so the ritual of the Saturday night bath, when it could be managed, became something of an event. The great tin tub would be dragged out and filled laboriously, kettle by kettle. And we would take our turns, my father first, as was proper, followed by my mother, and then us children, the water growing colder and murkier with each use. And there was truth, I can tell you, in the old saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, for by the time my youngest brother's turn arrived, one could barely see the bottom of the tub at all. For a penny, or perhaps tuppence if I could spare it, I sometimes treated myself to the public baths that had sprung up since the 1840s. Grand places they seemed to me then, echoing halls of tile and stone where hot water flowed in abundance. The Victoria Baths in Manchester, I remember, were called the Water Palace, and rightly so. But these were not merely places to scrub away the grime. No, they were centers of life and chatter places, where news passed from mouth to ear more freely than soap suds down a drain. Yet while we toiled to maintain the barest semblance of cleanliness, the wealthy luxuriated in copper or tin bathtubs attended by servants. I had heard tell of Lady Montague's rituals, her maid preparing rose-scented water in the mornings and laying out fine Turkish towels, an image as far from my world as the moon itself. And who could forget the example of Queen Victoria, whose marble bathroom at Windsor boasted one of the first showers in the land, a cascade of water summoned with the pull of a chain, as I was told. Soap, too, underwent a transformation during those years of my life. When I was a child, it was a coarse thing rendered from fat and lye so harsh it would strip the skin raw. But clever men like Andrew Peers brought forth gentle, transparent soaps in the 1860s. Their advertisements adorning shop windows, showing cherubic children and radiant ladies whose faces owed, so they claimed their glow, to Pears' soap. I recall hearing how the actress Lily Langtry was paid a fortune to lend her face to those adverts. A strange new world of celebrity and commerce, it seemed to me. Yet for many of us, such luxuries remained beyond reach. And so we relied on the old ways: vinegar rinses for the hair, oatmeal, scrubs for the skin, and soap crafted at home, dangerous stuff. It was with caustic soda that could burn a careless hand. My own mother had scars from one such mishap, and she often reminded me to handle the cauldron with care. One's clothing, of course, became the true marker of respectability. We who wore detachable collars and cuffs inventions from across the sea in Troy, New York, could at least appear tidy even if our shirts remained less than spotless. I remember how proud my brother was when he first sported a crisp white collar to work the very image of a respectable clerk. As for the ladies, their grand dresses, heavy as they were, would rarely be washed. Instead, layers of undergarments absorbed the sweat and oils sparing the fine silks. And so the phrase airing one's dirty laundry took on both a literal and figurative meaning in our world. Hair care, too, was a challenge. How many times did I watch my sisters dust their hair with flour or starch, combing it through to absorb grease, for the idea of washing hair with water cold as it was an unappealing prospect, especially without hot taps. Sarah Bernhardt, the famed actress, had made rice powder fashionable, and soon enough every girl I knew was trying it. The tonic sellers flourished, peddling bottles of strange mixtures, coconut oil, bear grease, fragrant oils from far-off lands, promising beauty in every drop. Macassar oil so popular that we began placing cloths upon the backs of chairs to protect them from stains, and what pride one felt in owning such things, even if second-hand. As for our teeth, well, dentists today would recoil in horror at our practices. Toothbrushes, when they could be had, were crude things of bone and bristle. We often made do with chalk or charcoal, sometimes cuttlefish bone ground fine. I recall the popular cherry toothpaste of the day, sweet-smelling, but likely more harmful than helpful. The Queen herself had a special tooth powder made of cuttlefish bone and myrrh, or so the papers said. Perhaps the most curious thing about those times was how intertwined hygiene was with morality. There were doctors who warned that washing too often would weaken the body, even invite illness, while preachers urged us to cleanse ourselves as a sign of godliness. Florence Nightingale, a name we all respected, wrote of the importance of washing hands, often especially for nurses. And in the countryside, folk clung to the old ways, using rainwater for washing herbs for fragrance, while we in the cities embraced every new product that promised cleanliness. And as the years passed, I lived to see new understanding emerge, how cholera spread through contaminated water, how sanitation might save lives. But old habits die hard, and for many the grime of the past clung stubbornly on even as the 20th century dawned. I can still remember the summer of 1858, a season so oppressive, so foul in its very essence that it seemed as though all of London might choke upon its own filth and collapse beneath the weight of its sins. The Thames, once a proud artery of the city, had by then become a stinking, roiling mass of waste, a river transformed into an open sewer that mirrored in its poisoned depths the heedlessness with which we had allowed our great city to grow without thought for cleanliness or consequence. I had walked its banks in those days, and the stench was beyond description, a fetid, clinging miasma that seemed to seep into the very stones, forcing even the strongest of men to gag and retch. The newspapers dubbed it the Great Stink, and rightly so, for the air itself became unbreathable. I remember a cartoon in Punch Father Thames introducing his offspring to the fair city of London, where the river was shown as an ancient wretch attended by cholera, typhoid, and plague, and never had satire struck closer to the truth. Years earlier, men of science had sounded the alarm. Michael Faraday, a name known to every educated Londoner, had cast white papers into the Thames to show its murky depths, writing that it had become an opaque, pale brown fluid, and warning of the dangers within. But still, little was done for too long. We had clung to medieval systems of waste disposal, cesspools beneath our homes and streets that leaked and overflowed with grim regularity. It is hard now to fathom the sheer scale of the neglect. I recall the figures well: more than 200,000 cesspools festering beneath the city, their contents seeping into basements and foundations. In the poorest quarters like St. Giles, the situation was dire, residents forced to cross their own flooded cellars upon planks, trying in vain to escape the rising tide of sewage. And I shall never forget the night soil men, grim figures who worked by lantern light, descending into those foul pits with little more than shovels and courage. Many lost their lives to the poisonous vapors that rose from the depths. I remember reading of 3 such men in Spitalfields suffocated while at their grim task. Yet despite this, we pressed on with so-called progress. The water closet, that marvel of modern invention, had become fashionable amongst the wealthy, but our sewers were woefully unprepared. I remember well when George Jennings popularized the device at the Great Exhibition of 1851, fine and clever, though it was, for each flush, sent more waste into an already collapsing system, overwhelming the cesspools, forcing ever more filth into the Thames itself, from whence much of our drinking water was still drawn. The irony was not lost on me, nor on the likes of Henry Mayhew, who wrote bitterly that the river had become a great dead well poisoned anew with each turning of the tide. By 1856, the pollution had reached such a state that even the copper hulls of boats began to corrode. And then came that dreadful summer, when the heat pressed down upon the city, and the river began to ferment. I remember the thermometers climbing past 48 degrees Celsius in the sun, the air thick and unmoving. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime were hung in Parliament in a vain attempt to mask the stench, but to no avail. Charles Barry purchased thousands of pounds of disinfectant, and still the odor seeped through stone and timber alike. Benjamin Disraeli, a man of great fortitude, was seen fleeing the chamber, unable to endure the foulness. The Times reported that even the strongest men vomited openly in the streets. At that time, many still believed in miasma, that disease traveled through the air itself. I myself had heard Florence Nightingale speak on the subject, and Dr. William Farr was a staunch advocate. And though we now know that their theory was flawed, it must be said that their fears helped push much-needed reform. I cannot fail to mention the great Dr. John Snow, whose meticulous work during the cholera outbreak of 1854 had already shown the link between tainted water and disease. His famous map of Soho with its clusters of death around a single pump remains etched in my memory. Though many scoffed at his conclusions, then none could deny that when he had the handle of that Broad Street pump removed, the deaths ceased almost at once. It was in those desperate days of 1858 that a true hero emerged, Joseph Bazalgette, a man of vision and iron resolve. I was there when the plans were first unveiled, a vast network of intercepting sewers, 82 miles of great tunnels, and over 1,000 miles of street sewers to catch the waste before it reached the Thames. The scale of it beggared belief: millions of bricks, hundreds of thousands of yards of concrete, all to be laid by hand. Yet I believed in it, and so did many others. I saw the embankments rise, Victoria Embankment among them, and marveled at the foresight that would serve London for generations. And indeed, it was not only our city that changed. Word of Bazalgette's triumph spread, and soon Manchester with its Thirlmere Aqueduct, and even Paris under the guidance of Baron Haussmann, followed suit. I myself toured the sewers of Paris once, and though grim, they were a marvel of modern engineering. I also witnessed the slow awakening of environmental consciousness. The smoke that had darkened our skies, pea soupers we called them, grew more frequent, more deadly. I remember hearing how sheep turned black with soot in Leeds, how acid rain began to poison our fields. Men like Robert Angus Smith gave us words for these new blights, and groups such as the Manchester Association for the Prevention of Smoke began to fight back. It was the first stirring, I think, of a movement that would in time reshape our very understanding of industry and nature. And the impact was real even in my own lifetime. I saw the death toll from cholera fall, typhoid fever retreat, life expectancy rise. Where once 14,000 lives were lost in a single year, to filth and disease the numbers fell and hope rose. By 1900, a Londoner might live to see 50 summers or more, thanks in no small part to those great sewers beneath our feet. When the Times wrote that the Thames was cleaner than it had been for centuries, I knew it was true. And as I look back now upon those dark days, I cannot help but marvel at what was accomplished. From the depths of filth, a new science of sanitation was born, one that would shape the cities of the world for generations to come. I remember well the fevered pace at which our great cities grew, brick upon brick, smokestack after smokestack, each one reaching hungrily toward the sky, as though in defiance of the heavens. It was a time of astonishing change when railways carved through green fields and factories belched out clouds of smoke that dimmed even the noonday sun. Yet amid the marvels of progress, we who lived in those times came to know all too well the bitter price that the Industrial Revolution demanded of the very air we breathed and the water we drank. In London, in Manchester, in Leeds, in every city and town touched by the hand of industry, the skies grew darker with each passing year. I would walk the streets and look up to see a pall of smoke so thick it turned day into twilight. And when the fogs came, those dreadful pea soupers, as we called them, one could scarcely see a hand held out before one's face. The stench of coal and chemicals clung to skin and clothing alike, and more than once I found myself coughing upon the blackened air eyes stinging with unseen poisons. I remember the day when the worst of these fogs descended upon London, the great smog of 1952, though by then I was an old man and it killed thousands. But the seeds of that disaster were sown long before in my youth, when no one thought to question the right of factory chimneys to spew their foul emissions unchecked into the heavens. Dickens himself wrote of it, painting vivid pictures in Bleak House where flakes of soot as large as snowflakes drifted down from the chimneys, turning the streets into rivers of mud and ash. Nor was the damage confined to the air. In Leeds, they said the sheep had turned black from the soot, their wool stained by the filth in which they grazed. I read of it in the Leeds Mercury in 1845, and the image haunted me, a living testament to what our industry was doing to the land. In Manchester, the scientist Robert Angus Smith, a man I came to admire greatly, first gave a name to a new and terrible phenomenon, acid rain. In 1852, he wrote of how the rain that fell upon our cities had turned sour, eating away at stone and metal alike, poisoning the soil and withering the leaves of the trees. It was a time when the cost of progress was measured not merely in money, but in sickness and suffering. Children wheezed and coughed in the tenements, their lungs blackened before they had even known their first joy. The rivers that once teemed with fish grew lifeless and stinking, choked with the refuse of factories. And in those grim days when it seemed that the very earth itself might sicken beneath the weight of our industry, a few brave souls dared to speak out. I remember well the formation of the Manchester Association for the Prevention of Smoke in 1842, one of the first organized efforts to fight back against the tide of pollution. It was led by none other than Dr. Peter Roget, the same Roget who would one day give us his famous thesaurus. And though many mocked their efforts at first, I counted myself among those who admired their courage. Their work led to the first smoke abatement legislation in 1843, a small step perhaps, but a beginning. And they were not alone. In Glasgow, two similar societies sprang up, determined to force the great industrialists to adopt cleaner, more efficient furnaces. I attended more than one such meeting in my youth, and I can still recall the fiery speeches of those who believed that the right to breathe clean air was a cause worth fighting for. It was not easy, and progress came slowly, for the mills and factories held great power, and many in Parliament had little appetite to challenge them. Yet change did come. The evidence could not be denied, as Bazalgette's great sewers had shown the way in matters of sanitation. So too did these early environmental movements lay the foundation for a new understanding of our place in the world. We began to see that industry could not be allowed to poison the earth without consequence, and that with knowledge and will, even the mightiest of engines could be made to burn cleaner. In time, the old soot-blackened skies began to clear, if only a little. And as I grew older, I took comfort in knowing that future generations would inherit a world in which the lessons of our folly had not been entirely forgotten. The struggle was long, and it continues even now, But those first steps taken in the smoke-filled streets of my youth marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the health of the land and the air would matter as much as the wealth drawn from the factory floor. I have stood in the wards of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the Great Barts of London, in the year of 1847. And what I saw there would chill even the most hardened heart today, for the ways of medicine then were grim indeed. The surgeons, men of skill and bravery, yet bound by the beliefs of their age, moved from one patient to the next, with blood-stiffened aprons that they wore with a kind of pride, as though each darkened stain was a badge of honor. Their knives, sharp and well used, were often clutched between their teeth as they worked, for there was no time to pause, and no thought that such habits might carry unseen dangers. It was not uncommon for these same hands, gloveless, unwashed, save for a quick wiping upon a coat sleeve, to pass from the dead to the living, from gangrenous wound to fresh incision, with no barrier save their own experience. The great Robert Liston, famed for his astonishing speed, for he could amputate a leg in less than 30 seconds, was one of many who worked thus. And though they saved some lives through skill and daring, many more were lost to that unseen enemy we could not yet name. In those days it was whispered amongst us that nearly half of all surgical patients would die not from the knife, but from what came after the fevers, the rotting of flesh, the slow slipping away into death. I remember James Simpson's words, that a man on the operating table faced worse odds than an English soldier at Waterloo. And in the maternity wards, too, the horrors were no less. I recall the dreadful accounts from Vienna, where in one clinic women were dying in such numbers from childbed fever that many preferred to give birth at home rather than face that place of death. It was there that Ignaz Semmelweis, a name now honored, though once scorned, made his great discovery. I have read of how his friend Jakob Koleka fell ill and died after an autopsy wound, his symptoms no different from those poor women who succumbed in childbirth. And from that grim clue, Semmelweis began his crusade, insisting that all who attended births must wash their hands with chlorinated lime. The results were miraculous deaths plummeted. Yet cruelly, his ideas were mocked, for many doctors of the day could not bear the implication that their own hands might bring death. Even across the ocean, Charles Moggs of Philadelphia dismissed such notions with the arrogant words, "Doctors are gentlemen, and gentlemen's hands are clean." How bitter those words must have sounded to Semmelweis, who ended his days broken, committed to an asylum by those too proud to admit their error. I think on his fate often, for it was a tragedy undeserved. Meanwhile, in our hospitals, the horrors continued. I can still remember the stories of Hôtel Dieu in Paris, beds crammed 6 to a space meant for 2 air so foul it condensed on the walls in fetid drops. At St. Thomas's in London, it was said that the same sponge was used to clean every wound in the ward, a practice that spread death as surely as any plague. It is no wonder that the poor feared our hospitals, then calling them houses of death, and that many like those described by Dickens chose to die at home rather than risk those accursed wards. The old theories still ruled the four humors, the miasma of bad air, and even great men such as Benjamin Rush clung to bloodletting long after it had done more harm than good. But change was coming, and I lived to see it unfold. Louis Pasteur, toiling in his modest laboratory in Paris, began to unlock the secrets of the invisible world. I read of his experiments with swan-necked flasks, how he proved that life did not arise from thin air, but from unseen organisms. Many scoffed even. The Lancet called it Germanic nonsense, but the truth would not be denied. And in Glasgow, a young surgeon named Joseph Lister, inspired by Pasteur's work, began his own battle against the death that haunted his wards. I still recall hearing of his first triumph, young James Greenlees, whose shattered leg might once have meant certain death. But under Lister's care, treated with sprays of carbolic acid, the boy lived, his leg saved. Lister's writings began to spread, though many in England and in America dismissed them, still unwilling to embrace this new gospel of antisepsis. Yet there were others champions of this new way, Florence Nightingale foremost among them. I remember her tireless work at Scutari during the Crimean War, where she found soldiers dying in squalor, their wounds unattended, the very air around them thick with disease. Through simple measures, cleanliness, fresh linens, ventilation, she wrought miracles, reducing deaths from near half to barely 2%. Her diagrams and statistics, those rose charts, spoke louder than any sermon, and her words would echo down the years. The very first requirement in a hospital is that it should do the sick no harm. In time, the work of Robert Koch, whose microscope revealed the bacillus of anthrax and later tuberculosis, provided the proof that none could now ignore. I remember reading of his famous demonstration to Paul Ehrlich, and even the old skeptics like Virchow had to admit, "I have seen it, and I must believe." Koch's postulates, those simple yet profound principles, laid the foundation of modern bacteriology. The change came slowly and not without resistance. Men like Sir William Savary decried the carbolic spray, calling it harmful, yet others, inspired by Lister, pressed on. I recall Agnes Hunt founding the first orthopedic hospital with strict antiseptic practices, and William Halsted, who introduced rubber gloves, first to protect a nurse's hands, and then seeing the improvement for all surgeons. By the 1890s, the world of surgery had been transformed. Instruments were sterilized, wards kept clean, the old reeking coats and blood-stiffened aprons cast aside. I have read that at Massachusetts General Hospital, the mortality rate for major surgeries fell from 43% to a mere 4%, an astonishing testament to what had been achieved. Even the very architecture of hospitals changed, built now with smooth, cleanable surfaces, wide windows for light and air, as at Johns Hopkins, a beacon of this new age of medicine. We had finally cast aside the miasma, embraced the truth of microbes, and in so doing saved countless lives. And as I reflect upon those long years, upon the stubbornness and the triumph, I think of the words of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who once wrote, "Science is the topography of ignorance." From a few elevated points, we triangulate vast spaces enclosing infinite unknown details. How true those words remain, for in each discovery, each hard-won lesson, we step a little further out of darkness into the light. I remember clearly how the year 1851 shone with excitement across London when the great Crystal Palace exhibition opened its gleaming halls to the world, a temple to industry and invention. I was there, one among the curious throng, marveling at the displays of steam engines and textiles. Yet what remains most vivid in my mind is not the machinery, but something far more humble, a room marked as the refreshing room where George Jennings had installed his new water closets. Such simple porcelain thrones, they seemed, yet they drew vast crowds, not merely for necessity, but out of sheer fascination. Imagine 1 penny for the privilege of flushing away one's waste, the act itself a kind of magic. I can still recall the papers writing of it, the Times, declaring that many attended the exhibition for that novelty alone. Even Queen Victoria herself expressed delight at the spectacle, marveling at the wondrous disappearance of that which we had long suffered to linger in chamber pots and cesspits. George Jennings captured the spirit of the age with his words, "The civilization of a people can be measured by their domestic and sanitary appliances," and I believe there was great truth in that. For in those days we were beginning to understand that cleanliness could be a measure of progress, of enlightenment even, and nowhere was this more evident than in the practices of personal grooming that soon transformed our daily lives. I often frequented the barber shops of London places, such as True Fit and Hill, established long before my time, but still thriving when I was a young man. There we gathered not only for the trim of hair or beard, but for the latest news, the ebb and flow of gossip, the pulse of the city. Our hair was dressed in those days with bear grease, genuine Russian bear fat, costly stuff at 5 shillings an ounce, dear enough that a day's wages might vanish in a pot of pomade. So great was the demand that bear farms were soon established in England itself to supply this curious fashion. I remember Charles Greville noting in his diary, "Gentlemen of quality would be seen in public without his hair properly dressed, with bear's grease." And indeed, it was so. Yet change crept in with the years. Macassar oil, much cheaper and more fragrant, soon swept the market. I myself fell prey to its charms. Roland's Macassar oil promised rare virtues, though we all knew it contained no exotic nut, merely coconut oil and clever perfumes. By the 1840s, tens of thousands of bottles were sold each year, and households began to drape anti-Macassar cloths upon their chairs, lest the oil stain the fabric beneath. Washing of the hair, however, remained infrequent. We had been taught by men such as physician J.C. Atkinson that too much washing would harm the scalp. Even Her Majesty's hairdresser, Mr. Wheeler, advised washing the Queen's hair but once every 3 weeks. Most women and many men relied instead upon Powder's dry shampoos made of starch or rice flour, brushed through each evening with great silver-handled brushes, 100 strokes a night. Such brushes, I remember, could cost a small fortune, £5 or more, the equivalent of a month's salary for a governess, yet they were prized possessions in many households. It was not until Charles Kaiser, a German hairdresser, introduced the first commercial liquid shampoo in 1890 that the tide began to turn. His Berlin salon drew crowds, and word of his miracle preparation soon spread across Europe. I remember reading that the wait for an appointment could stretch to 3 hours or more, and that royalty itself had begun to patronize his establishment. The quest for beauty, it seemed, knew no bounds. Yet with such quests came danger, for many of the preparations used by society, women were laced with poisons. I recall the terrible stories of arsenic-based face creams, how they promised a pale, perfect complexion, yet slowly destroyed the body. One product, Dr. Campbell's Safe Arsenic Complexion Wafers, was said to produce the loveliest skin imaginable, though at the cost of rotting teeth and a wasting frame. Harriet Hubbard. Eyre exposed such horrors in her writings, telling of a New York socialite whose vanity led her to consume these wafers until her very teeth fell from her mouth. Lead-based powders and enamels were no less deadly. I remember well the tragedy of Maria Gunning, Countess of Coventry, whose beauty had once dazzled all of London, yet who died at but 27, her body poisoned by the very makeup that had secured her fame. And still the products sold, Bloom of Neon powder rich in lead, or Dr. Mackenzie's complexion pills, which were not banned until 1901 after causing the deaths of at least 24 women in London alone. Among the great innovators of sanitation was Thomas Crapper, though contrary to popular tales, he did not invent the flush toilet. Yet through clever improvements and unmatched marketing, he made the device a household necessity. I remember reading of his 1861 patent for the floating ballcock, a simple mechanism that revolutionized the control of water flow. His Chelsea showroom, opened in 1907, boldly displayed working toilets, much to the shock of polite society, yet it was a masterstroke. Even the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, visited and was so impressed that he appointed Crapper's firm to the royal household. By the turn of the century, it became a mark of status among the wealthy to own one of Crapper's valveless waste preventers, and tales were told of the Rothschild family ordering no fewer than 30 units for their estate at Waddesdon Manor. But the true democratization of cleanliness came with soap. I can remember when soap was a luxury taxed so heavily that a single pound cost a third of a working man's wage. The removal of the soap tax in 1853, thanks to Gladstone, changed everything. William Lever's Sunlight soap soon followed its factory at Port Sunlight, a model of industrial welfare. By the late 1880s, the factory was producing hundreds of tons of soap each week, its clever advertising linking cleanliness to social success. I recall the famous Pears soap campaign, the Bubbles advertisement, that enchanted the public and drove sales to new heights. Soap became not just a product, but a symbol of health, of aspiration, of moral virtue. The Salvation Army itself distributed free soap with religious tracts, declaring that cleanliness is next to godliness. And indeed, it seemed that all of society had embraced this notion, for where once filth and disease reigned, now homes and persons gleamed with newfound pride. I have often pondered the lengths to which the women, and indeed at times the men of my age, would go in pursuit of beauty, and the perils that accompanied such vanities. For though the Victorian era is now remembered for its moral uprightness and its worship of cleanliness beneath those polished exteriors, there lurked a far darker truth, that the quest for flawless skin, for radiant complexions and shimmering hair, was fraught with deadly risks that many embraced knowingly, or else in tragic ignorance. It was in the drawing rooms and boudoirs of London, and in the pages of the fashion magazines that passed eagerly from hand to hand, that I first learned of these alarming practices. There, in bright advertisements and florid prose, one might encounter the praises of arsenic complexion, wafers, small white pills, their danger disguised by the promise of eternal youth. Dr. Campbell's safe arsenic complexion. Wafers they were called, and they claimed to deliver the loveliest skin imaginable, pale and unblemished, the very ideal of Victorian beauty. I recall the tales told of society ladies pale as porcelain, whose glowing faces concealed the rot beneath. Harriet Hubbard Eyre. That courageous writer exposed these horrors in her 1899 book, describing a New York beauty whose obsession drove her to consume so many of these wafers that her teeth fell loose, her very bones weakened by the poison she had so willingly swallowed. And arsenic was but the beginning. Lead, that ancient bane, found new life in the powders and paints of the era. I remember well the tragic story of Maria Gunning, Countess of Coventry, whose beauty had once caused a sensation across London society. She had used such lead-based preparations, thick white paints for the skin, rich enamels for the cheeks, until her body itself grew sick. Her death at 27 from lead poisoning shocked many, yet her example did little to curb the appetite for such deadly products. I often saw these items for sale, the bloom of neon face powder heavily advertised in the Punch magazines of the 1870s, its ingredients unlisted, yet its dangers well known in whispered circles. And there were others still, Dr. Mackenzie's complexion pills peddled to the hopeful and the vain until 1901, when their dangers became undeniable. I read in the papers that at least 24 women in London alone had died as a result of taking them, their nervous systems destroyed by the lead they had ingested. It was not only the skin that was endangered. Hair dyes of the time were no less perilous. Many contained salts of lead quicksilver or other noxious compounds that promised lustrous color, but delivered slow poisoning instead. I knew of more than one case where a woman's hair, once her pride, began to fall away in brittle clumps, or where a once bright eye grew dull and dim from the effects of the dye. Yet despite these dangers, or perhaps because the full extent of them was hidden behind promises of beauty and fashion, such products remained wildly popular. The culture of the day demanded perfection, and few could resist the lure of a new cream or powder that claimed to erase the marks of time or elevate one's standing in the world. The advertisements played upon this longing, often featuring the most admired beauties of the age, their images immortalized in art and print, their true sufferings concealed. and there was little recourse for the unfortunate victims. The medical profession of the time, still in the throes of outdated theories, offered little in the way of warnings or protections. It was only through the brave efforts of reformers, journalists, and a few pioneering doctors that public awareness slowly began to grow. I myself attended lectures in later years where the dangers of these beauty aids were laid bare, and yet even then the allure remained strong. For you see, in our world, a world of strict social codes and rigid hierarchies, appearance was a form of currency. A woman's beauty could secure her a favorable marriage, raise her family's fortunes, or open doors that might otherwise remain closed. And so many were willing to risk their health, even their lives, in the pursuit of that fleeting ideal. I have often thought back to those tragic tales and to the countless others lost to history, their names forgotten, their sufferings unrecorded, and wondered at the folly of it all. And yet I cannot judge too harshly, for I too lived in that age, and I too understood the pressures that drove them. In a society that valued appearances so highly, and in an age where the true dangers of these substances were only beginning to be understood, it is little wonder that so many fell prey to their charms. And so when I see now the gleaming bottles and powders of our own time safer, tested, and regulated as they are, I remember the lessons hard won in my own youth. I remember Maria Gunning and the nameless victims of Dr. Mackenzie's pills, and all those who suffered for beauty in an age that knew too little of the true cost of vanity. It amuses me now, in my old age, how often the name of Thomas Crapper is invoked, usually with a smile or a jest, as though he alone invented the flush toilet and changed forever the nature of private life. Yet I, having lived through those years of transformation, know the fuller truth, and while Crapper did not invent the device itself, he did more than any man of his generation to popularize and perfect it, bringing modern sanitation from the realm of the wealthy few into the homes of the aspiring many. The flush toilet, of course, was not a novelty of Crapper's day, for as early as 1775, Alexander Cumming had patented the first water closet with an S-shaped trap to keep the foul air at bay. Still, such devices remained rare and finicky, prone to foul odors and unreliable flushing, their use largely confined to the great country estates of the nobility. It was not until George Jennings displayed his improved version at the Great Exhibition of 1851, that very exhibition where I, too, marveled at the wonders of our age, that the modern flush toilet began its slow march into common use. But it was Thomas Crapper, a canny engineer and master of publicity, who made the water closet truly respectable. I remember well his 1861 patent for the floating ballcock, such a simple device, and yet it transformed the control of water flow within the cistern, making each flush both effective and economical. His showrooms in Chelsea, opened in 1907, were the talk of the town, for there, behind gleaming glass windows, stood row upon row of fully working toilets, displayed not in shame or secrecy, but with bold pride. Such a thing shocked many of our more delicate sensibilities. I can still recall a certain aunt of mine declaring that it was most improper for such articles to be placed upon public view. Yet the crowds came curious, amused, and increasingly convinced. And when Edward, Prince of Wales, later to ascend as King Edward VII, toured the showroom and appointed Crapper's firm as sanitary engineers to the royal household in 1891, the final seal of approval was granted. If a Crapper's device was good enough for the prince, it was good enough for any gentleman of means. And indeed, the social cachet of these fixtures soon became apparent. I heard stories well circulated in society circles of the Rothschilds ordering 30 such units for their newly built Waddesdon Manor, a mark of modern sophistication. In London, it became a mark of status to possess not merely a bathroom, but a fully equipped one boasting the latest of Crapper's innovations, the valveless waste preventer among them patented in 1881 and hailed for its efficiency. Yet it would be wrong to credit Crapper alone with the broader revolution in domestic sanitation that transformed Victorian life. Know that revolution required many hands and many years and no small amount of political will. For much of my youth, soap itself was a taxed luxury priced beyond the reach of working men. I remember when a single pound of soap might consume a third of a laborer's weekly wage, a cruel burden for those already struggling to maintain dignity amid the filth of the city. It was William Gladstone's repeal of the soap tax in 1853 that began to change this, unleashing a wave of innovation and industry. I can still recall the stir caused by William Lever's Sunlight Soap, a bright yellow bar whose very name spoke of cleanliness and modernity. His great Port Sunlight factory, with its model village for workers, became the envy of the industrial world. By the late 1880s, it was producing hundreds of tons of soap weekly, its advertisements linking cleanliness not merely with health, but with social advancement. Pear's soap, too, was an icon of the age. I remember the famous Bubbles advertisement, with its cherubic child and gleaming bar, a symbol of innocence and purity. The marketing was clever, for it appealed to the very heart of Victorian values to cleanliness as both a moral and a social imperative. Even the Salvation Army embraced this message, distributing free soap alongside religious tracts preaching that cleanliness is indeed next to godliness. Public baths, too, played their part, and I remember visiting those first great wash houses in Liverpool, built in the 1840s by James Picton. For a mere penny, even the poorest might enjoy a cold bath. For 2 pence, the luxury of hot water. Such places were not only for bathing, they became social centers, places where women might gather and converse while their laundry dried, where men might soak away the grime of labor and emerge refreshed. I remember hearing Lord Shaftesbury himself declare that these baths had done more to improve the morals of the working classes than any number of sermons, and in that I think he spoke truly. Yet it was in the private home that the great transformation occurred. The rise of indoor plumbing, slow at first, then irresistible, altered the very architecture of domestic life. I remember studying the new townhouse designs of Thomas Cubitt, with their dedicated bathrooms, their hot water systems, and flushing closets. For those with older houses, costly renovations were undertaken, for by century's end, no gentleman's residence was considered complete without such modern conveniences. New trades arose to meet this demand. The plumber, once a humble workman, became a respected figure, and firms like Dalton and Twyford grew wealthy, manufacturing the gleaming porcelain fixtures that graced the homes of the prosperous. I recall the triumph of Twyford's Unitas model, the first one-piece ceramic toilet, which won acclaim at the National Health Society exhibition in 1882. And as the century drew to its close, the forces of marketing turned increasingly to the women of the household, the mothers and wives charged with safeguarding the health of their families. Advertisements in The Lady, the Queen, and Mrs. Beeton's Great Book of Household Management proclaimed that cleanliness was a maternal duty, a mark of virtue. I recall the founding of the Women's Sanitary Association in 1857, led by Louisa Twining. Their pamphlets, distributed by the tens of thousands, brought the message of hygiene into the humblest homes. Thus, in the space of a generation, the daily habits of life were transformed. Where once filth and disease had seemed an inescapable part of urban existence, now cleanliness and sanitation had become not merely possible but expected, a revolution, wrought by engineers and entrepreneurs, by reformers and mothers alike. And at the heart of it, amidst all the soap and plumbing and porcelain, the humble flush toilet stood as a quiet symbol of progress, its every flush a triumph over the squalor of the past. There are times when I sit and reflect upon how the simplest of things, a bar of soap, a basin of clean water, can alter the course of lives, even of history itself. For in the days of my youth, these everyday luxuries were far from commonplace. I can remember well when soap was still a precious commodity, taxed so heavily that only the well-to-do could afford to use it freely, while the poor struggled to keep themselves and their homes from falling under the grim shadow of filth and disease. It was not until the tax upon soap was lifted in 1853, a triumph of common sense for which we have Mr. Gladstone to thank, that true change began. I saw it with my own eyes, how in the space of a few years, what had once been a luxury became a necessity embraced not only by the upper classes, but by the working families of London, Manchester, Liverpool, and beyond. And with this new accessibility came innovation, a blossoming of industry and marketing that would sweep across Britain like a cleansing tide. William Lever's Sunlight Soap. I still recall the bold yellow bars that filled the shop windows led the charge. His factory at Port Sunlight, with its enlightened model village for workers, stood as a testament to a new kind of industrial idealism, where prosperity and welfare might walk hand in hand. By the late 1880s, that factory was producing hundreds of tons of soap each week, and clever advertisements linked its use not merely with hygiene, but with moral virtue and upward mobility. A clean home is a happy home, they proclaimed, and in those words many found both inspiration and aspiration. Nor can I forget the brilliance of Pear's soap, those famous advertisements featuring cherubic children and luminous ladies, the iconic Bubbles campaign that captured the Victorian imagination. I remember hearing how the painting by Sir John Everett Millais, purchased for a staggering sum, had been used to promote the soap, and how sales soared as a result. It was no longer enough simply to be clean. One must also be seen to be clean, to project to the world an image of respectability through gleaming skin, spotless linen, and fragrant hair. The Salvation Army, ever mindful of both body and soul, took up this message with fervor, distributing bars of soap alongside their religious tracts. Cleanliness is indeed next to godliness, they preached, and in this, at least few could disagree. For in the slums and alleys of the great cities where disease once bred unchecked, the spread of soap and the habits of hygiene it encouraged brought about a quiet revolution in health and dignity alike. Yet soap alone could not suffice, not without water in abundance and a place in which to use it. And so it was that the public bath emerged as one of the great engines of social progress in my lifetime. I remember well the opening of Britain's first public washhouse in Liverpool back in 1842, designed by the architect James Picton, a man of vision and compassion. It served over 1,000 people each week in its early days, a beacon of hope in a city still reeling from the ravages of cholera and poverty. I myself visited many such establishments in later years. For a penny, one might enjoy a cold bath. For 2 pence, the rare luxury of hot water. In London alone by 1896, there were 25 public baths serving more than 2 million bathers annually, a staggering figure that speaks to the thirst, not just for cleanliness, but for dignity that dwelled within the hearts of the working poor. I think often of Frederick Furness, the pioneer who established the Bell Street Baths in London in 1846, a place where working families could bathe and launder their clothes for but a minimal fee. I recall the great conversation room where women would gather while their washing dried, sharing news and stories, building the bonds of community that so often fray in times of hardship. In Manchester, the industrialist Henry Pochin funded penny baths for the same purpose, and I remember reading Lord Shaftesbury's words in his diary. These baths have done more to improve the morals of the working classes than any number of sermons. Indeed, he was right, for when people are granted the means to maintain their dignity, they are less likely to fall into despair. And so it was with the rise of indoor plumbing as well, which, though slower to spread than soap and baths, gradually transformed the very nature of domestic life. In the grand townhouses of Belgravia designed by Thomas Cubitt, whose name became synonymous with elegance, dedicated bathrooms began to appear complete with hot running water and modern fittings. For those of humbler means, older homes were painstakingly retrofitted at great cost, but with immense pride. By century's end, no respectable middle-class household would be without proper bathing facilities. In those years, the plumber rose to new prominence, no longer a mere laborer, but a skilled tradesman whose work ensured the health and comfort of entire families. I recall the success of firms like Dalton and Twyford, whose finely crafted porcelain fixtures graced the finest homes. Twyford's Unitas model, the first successful one-piece ceramic toilet, won great acclaim at the National Health Society exhibition in 1882, a triumph of both function and form. And as these innovations spread, so too did the message of hygiene. Women in particular were targeted as the guardians of their family's health, a responsibility both moral and practical. Pear's Soap's famous 1886 advertisement, the image of a child in a bath created by Millet, cemented this association. Women's magazines such as The Lady and the Queen filled their pages with articles on personal cleanliness and household management, while Mrs. Beeton's book of household management, which I remember selling 60,000 copies in its first year alone, devoted entire chapters to the subject. The Women's Sanitary Association, founded in 1857 by the reformer Louisa Twining, played a vital role in this crusade, distributing pamphlets on hygiene to working-class mothers, more than 100,000 homes reached by 1870. I saw their efforts firsthand, and I know the good they did. Thus, by the closing years of the century, a remarkable transformation had taken place. What had once been the privilege of the wealthy had become, if not universal, then at least broadly accessible. In 1897, I read an advertisement that summed it up well. The difference between savage and civilized man is the difference between dirty and clean habits. And though such words may strike the modern ear as harsh, they reflected the spirit of the age, an age that believed with earnest conviction that through soap water and education, society itself might be elevated. As I reflect upon the homes of my youth, the old London terraces with their smoky hearths and drafty stairwells, I cannot help but marvel at how the rise of indoor plumbing transformed not only the architecture of our houses, but the very rhythm of daily life itself. For in those early days, bathing remained a laborious task, one that required kettles of water carried by hand, a great tin tub dragged forth into the kitchen or scullery, and a long afternoon of toil for those who wished to scrub themselves clean. But as the century progressed and the wonders of sanitation engineering crept steadily into our homes, a new vision of domestic comfort began to emerge, one in which water flowed at the turn of a tap, hot and plentiful, and in which the bathroom itself came to be seen as a mark of refinement, even of social standing. I remember well when such notions first began to take root amongst my acquaintances. The architects, of course, led the charge, men like Thomas Cubitt, whose grand designs for Belgravia townhouses in the 1820s boldly included rooms set aside for bathing. At first, these were luxuries afforded only by the very wealthy, but soon the idea began to trickle downward, as all great fashions must. It was Queen Victoria herself who did much to popularize the concept. I recall reading with interest that in 1861, Her Majesty had installed a hot air bath at Osborne House, her beloved retreat on the Isle of Wight, a marvel of modern engineering that combined both comfort and health. From that moment, the well-appointed bathroom began to take on a new significance. It was no longer a mere place of necessity. It became a space for ritual, for self-care, and increasingly for display. In those years, the humble plumber rose in stature for without his skill, no home could hope to boast such modern conveniences. I watched as the trade grew in esteem, and as firms such as Dalton and Twyford made their fortunes crafting the gleaming porcelain fixtures that would soon become coveted items amongst the middle and upper classes. I remember the great triumph of Twyford's Unitas model, the first one-piece ceramic toilet, which won a gold medal at the National Health Society exhibition in 1882. It was a thing of both beauty and practicality, and its success heralded a new age of domestic design. By the dawn of the 20th century, to possess a fully equipped bathroom was the aspiration of every respectable household. I remember the words of architect Robert Kerr, whose influential book, The Gentleman's House, declared in 1871, "No gentleman's house is complete without proper bathing facilities." And indeed, he spoke truly, for what had once been the preserve of palaces had become at last the goal of every rising family, a symbol of progress and modernity. Of course, such transformations did not occur in isolation. They were driven by a wider cultural movement, one in which hygiene was increasingly linked to morality and social virtue. And nowhere was this more evident than in the realm of advertising, where clever marketers turned their gaze toward women, portraying them as the guardians of their family's health. I recall the famous Pears soap advertisement from 1886, the painting of a child in a bath crafted by the great John Everett Millais, which became an icon of its time, elevating the act of bathing into a maternal duty. Women's magazines such as The Lady and the Queen embraced this message, eagerly filling their pages with advice on personal cleanliness and the proper outfitting of the modern home. And Mrs. Beeton's book of household management, which I remember selling in staggering numbers, devoted entire chapters to the subject, instructing women not only in the art of housekeeping, but in the moral imperative of maintaining cleanliness within the home. Such messages found fertile ground, for the women of the era took pride in their role as arbiters of domestic virtue. And as indoor plumbing became more widespread, first in the grand townhouses of London, then in the villas of the provinces, and finally in the better-built terraces of the working class, the bathroom itself became a stage upon which these values were displayed. It was a costly investment, to be sure. I remember that by 1900, the outfitting of a modern bathroom could cost as much as £100, a sum equivalent to a year's salary for a middle-class clerk. Yet many were willing to make such sacrifices, for the rewards were both tangible and intangible. To own a bathroom with running hot water, a proper flush toilet, and the latest fixtures from Twyford or Dalton, this was to mark oneself as part of the new modern society, one that embraced science progress and the civilizing power of cleanliness. Thus, as the century drew to a close, I watched as the bathroom evolved from a humble necessity to a symbol of status and aspiration. Where once a battered tin tub had sufficed, now gleaming porcelain reigned. Where once water had been carried laboriously by hand, now it flowed freely from polished taps. And in this transformation, I saw not merely the triumph of industry, but a quiet revolution in the daily lives of men and women, one in which the pursuit of cleanliness had become a shared ideal, and in which the home itself had been reshaped to reflect this new understanding. As I look back upon those years when the gospel of cleanliness spread through every corner of our society, I cannot help but reflect upon the central role that women, and in particular the mothers of the nation, came to play in this quiet revolution. For it was in their hands that the task of domestic hygiene was placed, and it was upon their shoulders that the moral burden of safeguarding the family's health so often rested. I can still recall how in my younger days, the advertisements for soap, for bathing products, for the very fittings of modern bathrooms began to speak directly to women, urging them to embrace cleanliness, not merely as a matter of propriety, but as a solemn duty. The image that lingers most vividly in my mind is that famous Pears soap advertisement from 1886, the one painted by John Everett Millay, a cherubic child in a gleaming tub, the mother's unseen care made manifest in every spotless detail. It was more than an image of domestic bliss. It was a call to action, a message that resonated with the values of the age. The magazines of the time echoed this theme with tireless enthusiasm. I remember thumbing through the pages of The Lady and the Queen, where articles on household management shared space with fashion and society gossip. There, in elegant prose, women were instructed in the latest methods of cleaning, in the virtues of hot water and fresh air, and in the importance of setting a moral example for their children through the very order and purity of the home. Of course, the great Mrs. Beeton had led the way with her book of household management, a veritable Bible of domestic life that sold tens of thousands of copies in its first year alone. I remember the early editions, well-whole chapters devoted to personal cleanliness, to the proper care of linens and garments, to the duties of the mistress, in ensuring that every member of her household maintained not only outward decency, but inward virtue as well. For in that era, the line between physical cleanliness and moral purity was drawn with firm and unwavering hand. To be clean was to be respectable, to be virtuous, and conversely, to neglect the duties of hygiene was seen as a failure of character, a lapse that could reflect shame not only upon the individual, but upon the entire family. Women understood this instinctively, for it was instilled in them from the cradle, and they embraced the role with a mixture of pride and solemn obligation. It was not only among the middle and upper classes that this message took root. Through the tireless efforts of reformers, the gospel of hygiene was carried into the working class homes as well, where the battle against dirt and disease was fought daily and with great determination. I think with particular admiration of Louisa Twining, that remarkable woman who founded the Women's Sanitary Association in 1857. Their work in distributing pamphlets on hygiene to working mothers over 100,000 homes, reached by 1870, stands as one of the great unsung triumphs of the Victorian age. I remember seeing those pamphlets myself, tucked into kitchen drawers or pinned to walls in humble cottages. They spoke in plain language, offering practical advice on everything from hand washing to the airing of rooms, from the safe storage of food to the importance of boiling water. And though many of the recipients were women who had never known the luxury of a formal education, they took these lessons to heart, driven by the same fierce love for their families that animated their wealthier sisters in townhouses and villas. For it was a time when mothers knew in their bones that the health and future of their children depended in no small measure upon their own diligence. Cholera and typhoid still haunted the poorer districts. The memory of the great epidemics was fresh in every mind, and so whether through soap and water or through the careful maintenance of a clean and orderly home, women fought back with a determination that was at once deeply personal and profoundly communal. In this, they were aided by the changing face of commerce, for manufacturers were quick to recognize the power of the feminine purse and the feminine conscience. I saw it in the advertisements that filled the newspapers and periodicals, in the brightly colored posters that adorned the shops. Buy this soap and your children will be strong. Install this modern lavatory and your home will be pure. Adopt these new sanitary products and your family will thrive. The message was always the same: the well-being of the household lay in the hands of its women, and through their vigilance all might be made clean and wholesome. Thus it was through 1,000 small acts, the scrubbing of floors, the boiling of linens, the teaching of children to wash their hands, that the great transformation was wrought. And though the engineers and doctors of the age rightly earned their fame, it was the mothers of Britain who carried the new gospel of hygiene into every street and alley, into the very heart of domestic life. As I reflect now upon that time, I see clearly that this quiet revolution, did more than alter the physical conditions of our homes. It reshaped the very fabric of our society, elevating the status of women by recognizing, however subtly, their central role in the health and moral life of the nation. And though the old advertisements may have faded, and the language of duty given way to the language of choice, the legacy of those Victorian mothers endures in every gleaming sink and every child taught to wash before supper. As I sit here now in this modern age where a hot bath is but a twist of a tap away, and where gleaming white tiles line even the humblest of homes, I find myself often reflecting upon how far we have come, and how the obsessions and labors of my own generation, born of filth and necessity, laid the foundation for the world of hygiene that so many today take for granted. For I was there to witness it, the steady march of cleanliness through every rank of society, the rise of soap from a taxed luxury to a household staple, the transformation of the humble washhouse into the respectable bathroom, the triumph of science over superstition in the fight against disease. I remember reading in an old advertisement of 1897 the bold proclamation, "The difference between savage and civilized man is the difference between dirty and clean habits." And though the phrasing may now seem harsh to modern sensibilities at the time, it captured a truth that we Victorians held dear, that cleanliness was not merely a matter of health, but of progress, of moral fiber, of one's place in a civilized society. Indeed, the very obsession with cleanliness that so defined my era sprang from a confluence of forces, the discoveries of science, the urgings of reformers, the clever enticements of advertisers, and the earnest desires of countless men and women to better the lives of their families. I think of Florence Nightingale, who wrote so wisely in her notes on nursing that every nurse ought to wash her hands frequently throughout the day, and if her face, too, so much the better. Simple words, yes, and yet in their simplicity, revolutionary, for they laid bare the link between the body and the unseen world of germs, and between the practice of cleanliness and the preservation of life. I think, too, of Edwin Chadwick, whose labors to improve sanitation saved untold thousands, and whose blunt words still echo in my mind. The greater the dirt, the greater the effort required to remove it. It was a creed that we all came to know well, for in those years, the battle against filth was relentless, fought on every front, in the home, in the hospital, in the sewers beneath our feet, and in the very air we breathed. And what a battle it was. I still remember the stinking Thames of my youth, the great stink of 1858, that drove Parliament from its chambers and at last spurred the city to action. I remember the grim wards of the old hospitals where surgeons moved from one bloodied patient to another with scarcely a thought for antisepsis. I remember the cheap powders and dangerous creams that promised beauty but delivered sickness and death. And yet, through the courage of reformers, through the toil of engineers and physicians, through the quiet perseverance of housewives and mothers, all this began to change. By the close of the century, the results were plain for all to see. Life expectancy had risen, infant mortality had declined, once feared diseases had been brought to heal. Soap and water, once the preserve of the wealthy, had become the everyday tools of the common man. The bathroom, once a rarity, now occupied a place of honor in every modern home. And more than this, the very idea of cleanliness, of personal and domestic hygiene, had become enshrined in our culture, passed down from mother to child, neighbor to neighbor, generation to generation. It is strange now to think that so much of this began in so humble a place, with a simple bar of soap, a bowl of hot water, a mother teaching her child to wash behind his ears. Yet such are the foundations upon which great changes are built. For as Florence Nightingale knew, as Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur taught us, as Robert Koch proved beyond doubt, the war against disease is fought not only in laboratories, but in kitchens and sculleries, in bedrooms and nurseries, in every home where a mother wipes down a counter or a child learns to wash his hands. And though much has changed in the years since, I believe that the spirit of that Victorian crusade still lives on. We may no longer speak in such grand terms of virtue and morality, but the ideals remain that a clean home is a healthy one, that personal hygiene is a mark of respect for oneself and for others, that through small daily acts, we may yet keep sickness at bay. And so I say to those who live in this modern age of convenience and abundance, remember what was won and at what cost. Remember the filth and the darkness from which we rose, and honor the memory of those who fought to bring light and cleanliness to the world. For if we forget, we may yet find ourselves repeating the follies of the past. As I once heard it said, and I know it to be true, the Victorians may have faced unimaginable filth, but their determination paved the way for modern hygiene. And for that, we who follow in their footsteps owe them a debt that cannot easily be repaid.